and welcome back. My name is Nathan House and I'm with the Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that would be appreciated. We're going to be back in the book of James, and today we're going to be looking at the major theme of works, of action, of doing, that James is going to call his readers to not just say something, not just have this statement of your faith, but to have actions that demonstrate your faith. So we're going to look at that James is going to call his readers to action. And that's going to be the theme that we're going to look at today. James calling the readers to act, to do, to work. But one of the things we're going to look at before we get into that, one of the passages that's going to be key in our discussion is from James chapter 2, and a common something that's very familiar to most of us, or to many of us at least, will be this discussion on faith and works. And I want to kind of briefly address James and how he uses the idea of faith and works compared to Paul in faith and works. Well, why are we doing that? Because some have been confused. There's been confusion as to how do you take James and his words and Paul and his words and not see them as contradictory. Well, here's how you see them as not contradictory, because James and Paul are using them with a different purpose, with a different meaning. Paul's writings, he's writing to combat a false idea that the Jews had, that I can earn salvation by keeping the law. That if I keep the law, God will be indebted to me. He will owe me the promises of Abraham. He will owe me the inheritance. He will owe me essentially salvation. So Paul writes the book of Romans, the book of Galatians, to combat this false idea. Now you can see on the screen I have Romans chapter 4, and I've kind of cut and pasted a few of these different verses just to kind of give a little bit of a feel for what I'm talking about. But I want to go ahead and read this. Now, to the one who works, talking about for his salvation, for his inheritance, for the gifts, the promises of Abraham. So how is he working? He's trying to keep the law. Now, to the one who works for his salvation, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his payment. What is his due? Right? If I'm earning my salvation and I get salvation, well, why did I receive salvation? Because I earned it. It was my payment. Look at what Paul says. The promises to Abraham did not come through the law, that is, law-keeping, works of the law. The promises to Abraham didn't come through that. But what? But through the righteousness of faith. For the law brings wrath. That is why salvation, the promises of Abraham, that is why it depends on faith. So Paul's use of work in the book of Romans, the book of Galatians, is talking about the keeping of law, a system of salvation. How am I going to receive salvation? Is it going to be by keeping the law through works, or is it going to be by putting my faith in Jesus Christ? So Paul was dealing with a problem that was occurring where people thought they could keep the law and earn salvation. So again, the idea that you're earned, it's payment, your work, your salvation or grace is given by keeping the law. So thus, the one who worked then for his salvation doesn't need God's gift. So now this is in contrast to the idea of faith or trust in the books of Romans and Galatians. What is faith or what is trust? It's depending on God, depending on His plan, His Savior, to do for me what I can't do for myself. I can't earn salvation. So faith, belief in Paul's writings is a system of salvation, and it's in contrast to the idea that I can work and earn salvation. Now James uses faith and works differently. James' use of works is not talking about a system of salvation. James' use of works is talking about a demonstration of a genuine faith. It's talking about acts of obedience. So we have to begin with understanding that James is coming from a different place, dealing with a different problem than Paul is dealing with. And so let's go ahead and let's look at our text. Let's go into our text for today. And we're going to see that right away in this theme, James is going to call people to act. So we're going to see these, what I'm going to call them, action verses. And we're going to see this action words highlighted here in dark blue. And we'll talk about these words a minute. But look at verse 22 of chapter 1. But be doers. So here's an imperative verb. It's underlined in triple underlined. But be doers. So it's a command, right? Be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer and not a doer, what kind of a person is this? Someone who hears but doesn't do. He's like a guy that he looks into the mirror in the morning and he looks and he's like, man, my hair's a mess. I don't know what I got going on with my nose or my eyes, whatever. I'm a mess, right? I gotta fix my face. But then he leaves the mirror and he doesn't do anything to his face. He doesn't fix his hair. He doesn't make his face look decent. That's like the same person who looks into the law of liberty, the perfect law, the law of liberty, and he reads this, he sees what he needs to do, but he doesn't do it. I need to make this change in my life. I need to do better in this area of my life, but he doesn't put that into practice. He's like a person who looks in the mirror and walks away and doesn't do anything, right? So he says, but the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. So be doers. Be a doer. Be blessed in your doing. Now, this is a different word. So this word here, doer, it's the Greek word poieo. And again, you don't need to know that, except for I want you to see that it's different than this word, which is also an action word. It's the word ergon, or usually it's translated as work in the book of James, but here it's translated as acts by the ESV. Here, but being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts. So James, in this theme, he's calling his followers to be a people that work, that act out their faith. And so let's go to another action verse here. Go to chapter 2, verse 8. If you really fulfill the royal law, according to Scripture, so we have him talking about fulfilling up here. Where do we see that? Where do we see that? Verse 22. The perfect law, the law of liberty. Here down here, he says, if you want to really fulfill the royal law, and again, he tells us what the royal law is. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. He says, if you really want to fulfill the royal law, you are doing well. So you are doing something that is good. So again, he's acting it out. You're doing well. But if you show partiality, you are committing sin and are convicted by the law as transgressors. For whoever keeps the whole law but fails in one point of it has become guilty of it all. Let's look at verse 12. So speak and so act. So again, look at what he says. Speak and act. So is it enough just to speak? Paul calls his readers to do more than just speak. Speak and act as those who are to be judged. Verse 13. For judgment is without mercy to the one who has shown, and this word is translated shown here, but it's the word that's been translated do. Here it's translated act. So it's the same word, and again, I'm trying to show you that with the blue. But again, what do we see here? These are action verses. You're doing well. So speak and so act. Judgment is without mercy to the one who has done no mercy, or who hasn't shown mercy. Let's come down a little bit later. We're going to skip over some just for the sake of time. But you can look at chapter 3, verse 13. You can look at chapter 3, verse 18. And you can look at some others as well. But for the sake of time, again, we're going to come down here to chapter 4, verse 11. I want to just show you this one real quickly. But if you judge the law, you are not a doer, right? We're supposed to be doers of the law. Come and look at verse 17. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. So again, there is this theme running through the book of James about doing, about acting, about working. And again, the key text, which we're going to go to now, is from James chapter 2. And in this text, it has it's the one that is probably more common to most of us, or many of us anyways, where he's going to now use this word translated as works. The primary word we've been seeing so far is what we'll see here in verse 19 is the word poieo, the word do. And it occurs again here, but now he's going to use a different word, the word ergon, translated primarily as works. But here's what I want you to see. These are action verses again. So again, James is going to call the readers to work. So this is in contrast to being chapter 1, verse 2. It's in contrast to being a hearer only. It's in contrast to chapter 4, verse 11, those who judge but don't do. It's in contrast to those in chapter 4, verse 17, who know the good thing they ought to do but don't do it. So some early believers, and this is an interesting word here as well, I'll try to highlight it real quick. Some of the early believers were saying, and I would circle this in my Bible if I were you. Some of them in the early church, some early Christians were saying one thing, but they were not acting it out. So this word says, and we'll kind of talk about it here, becomes an interesting little thread that runs through this as well. So James begins this section in verse 14 with a question. He says, what good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? So now he's going to kind of deal with this scenario, this question that's been proposed. Can that faith save him? So here's the question, right? So James is now going to, in the next few verses, he's going to answer this question, this idea of someone who says he has faith. He says he has faith, but he doesn't have work. Can that kind of faith save him? And so as we talked about in the previous video, James illustrates something, and then he makes a point, and then an illustration, then a point. So we're going to see that pattern here played out again as well. So here's the question, verse 14. Now he's going to illustrate his what he's going to try to prove here, that you have to have more than just saying, you have to have doing, you have to have acting it out, you have to have work. You have to have more than just a mental assent, right? I can say one thing, or I can even believe it, but if it's not acted out in my daily life, it is of no good. It is of no benefit. So look at verse 15 and 16 as he tries to illustrate his point. He says in verse 15, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says, right? Someone says he has faith but doesn't have works. Here in verse 16, one of you says, you know what? I see you over there. I see that you're hungry over there, and I see you're cold. Go get some food, buddy. Go get a jacket. That's what you tell them, right? He says, one of you says, go in peace, be warmed and filled. Without giving him the things needed for the body, he asks another question here. Is that any good? Does that benefit anybody? And that's what the word good here means. Does it benefit? Does that benefit anybody to see someone who's freezing, who's starving to death, and you say to them, go get a jacket, go get a burger? So James is illustrating that faith without action, faith without works, that if you are simply someone who says something, he's illustrating in verse 15 and 16 that that's of no benefit. So then he makes verse 17 is again a point. So right, illustration, point, illustration, point. So verse 17, point. So also faith by itself, and I want to draw your attention to this this statement, by itself. He's going to use different expressions to demonstrate this same point, right? It's by itself. Here's faith, here's works. Faith is not with works. Faith is by itself. Later on, he's going to use the word faith is alone. He's also going to say faith is apart from these other things. So the idea here that we're going to see that James keeps, and it's a different expression, but the idea is the same. Faith isn't with anything. Faith isn't with works. Faith is by itself. Faith is alone. Faith is apart from. And we'll draw attention to those expressions as we come to them. But here in verse 17, here again is his point. So faith by itself, if it does not have works, it's dead. There's the point. Verse 18 and 19 are an illustration again. Some of you will say, and again, we notice this word say, right? Because we saw that back up here in verse 14. Someone says he has faith. One of you says, go and get a jacket, and I hope you get a jacket, I hope you get a burger. Someone will say, you have faith and I have works. Look at what James says. Show me. Show me. This is again an imperative verb. Show me your faith apart from, right? What have we seen? By itself. Now we have this expression apart from. Show me your faith apart from your works. I will show you my faith by my works. Here's the illustration, right? You believe that God is one. That was, from the book of Deuteronomy, the Shema, right? That the Jews would recite in recognition of the greatness of God, the oneness of God. James says, you believe that God is one, you do well. That's that word we've seen several times already. You do well. You believe God is one. You're doing well. You know who else believes God is one? The demons. So you believe God is one. You know who else does? The demons. So we have this illustration here in verse 18 and 19. And again, I want to draw your attention. By itself, apart from. And we tie this back into chapter 1, verse 22, right? Where there's people who were hearers only. In a minute, we'll tie this into verse 24, where he uses the expression faith alone. So faith is, in James's little argument here, faith that is alone, faith that is apart from, faith that is by itself, faith that is hearing only. It's not a living faith. This is not a faith that is of any benefit. He now illustrates this point again. How? He compares it to demons, because demons have this kind of faith. So what kind of a faith does a demon have? Is it a saving faith? Is it a life-giving faith? Of course not. Come to verse 20 where we have another point. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person? Here's his point. that faith apart from, again, there's that expression apart from, verse 20, saw it back in verse 18, that faith apart from works is useless. So there's the point. He's now going to return to illustrating this point. Was not Abraham our father justified by works? When was he justified by works? When he offered his son Isaac on the altar. You see that faith was active. And this word active here is a compound word. It's the word works along with the word with. So it's sun, ergo, sun ergo. Sun means with, ergo means work. So look at this. You see that faith was working with. That's what that word sun ergo means, right? You see that faith was working with his works. So faith, in the life of Abraham, faith wasn't alone. It wasn't by itself. Faith wasn't set apart from works. Faith was in fact working along with works. Faith, again, I'm going to say that again. Faith was working along with works. And his faith was completed by his works. Come down. So here again, that's an illustration of the idea that faith needs works. Then we see verse 24, we have again a point. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone, right? We see this similar theme, apart from, by itself, alone. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. He's going to end this chapter with two more illustrations of faith apart from works, or faith with works. And in the same way, he talks about Rahab. She's an illustration of faith and works. Your body, our body and our spirit, is an illustration of faith and works. For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. So as you go back and you look at what James has said about faith without works, what has he said about it? Well, first of all, he says in verse 17 and also in verse 26 that faith without works is dead. He also says that faith without works in verse 16, he says it is of no benefit, right? He says, what good is that? What benefit is that? Faith without works, it is of no benefit. Faith without works is dead. We come to verse 20, and what does he say? Faith without works is useless. And perhaps the most striking statement he makes about faith without works is demonic. Verse 19. Faith without works is demonic. It's a demonic faith. It's a demonic belief. The demons believe. So James, his message to the readers is that your faith has to be more than just saying something. It has to be more than just talking something. It has to be more than just a mental affirmation of God. Our faith as Christians has to be lived out. We are not people who say we have faith. We are people who live out our faith. We're not people who say, I hope your needs are met today. But we are people who meet the needs of others. And as you look into the mirror, if that's not who you are with your Christian faith, if you look into the mirror, then change that. Don't be a hearer of the word and not a doer. Look into the mirror and say, you know what, I need to make a change in my life. My faith has been simply a mental assent. My faith has been simply speech only, but no more. Make your faith something that is lived out, as James calls these early readers to be. And I want to take you to one other passage real quick, to the Sermon on the Mount, because I've made the point that James, he is mirroring to some degree some of Christ's major teachings in the Sermon on the Mount, and this is no different. This is no different here. Look at Matthew chapter 7, verse 21. Towards the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven. Watch this. But the one who does. This is that same word that we saw all through James, that poieo word. But the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven, he's the one who will enter the kingdom of heaven. And Jesus highlights this again a few verses later. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and does them. This has to take us back. We have to cross-reference this to James chapter 1, verse 22. Don't be hearers only, but doers, right? Look at what he says. Everyone then who hears and does. The person that hears and does, they're a wise person. That's in contrast to the one who hears and does not do. You see, that's what demons do. That's a useless faith. It's a dead faith. It is a faith of no benefit. Jesus calls us to be hearers and doers. James calls us to be hearers and doers. Friends, brothers, sisters, let's be people that put our faith into action. You guys have a great day. God bless.